Hey guys, tonight we're heading back nearly 1,000 years into the candlelit corridors, echoing halls, and secret passageways of medieval castles. You've probably imagined them before. Tall towers rising through mist, banners fluttering, and guards clanking their armor while a fire crackles somewhere deep within. But tonight, we're not here for the knights or kings. We're here for the engineers, the unsung geniuses who made all that stone breathe, bend, and stand tall for centuries. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these sleepy stories travel. Imagine yourself walking up a winding hill, torches flickering against the evening fog. You can hear the drawbridge creaking as it lowers, the scent of rain on ancient wood. The castle looms, not a ruin, but alive, humming faintly with the rhythm of pulleys, chains, and hidden tunnels. Every wall, every archway was a puzzle solved by a builder who had no blueprint, only intuition, geometry, and grit. As you step through the gate, notice the chill, the kind of cold that whispers stories of siege and survival. Somewhere above, a lantern sways, its golden light dancing across carved stone. The air feels heavy but safe. You're about to uncover the forgotten secrets that kept these fortresses standing through centuries of war, rain, and time itself. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before any wall could rise, before the first tower could stretch toward the sky, every castle began with something invisible, its foundation. You can almost picture it. Muddy boots, cold mornings, the sound of chisels biting into bedrock. The lords and masons would point toward a hilltop and declare, "Here it shall stand." But the ground had to agree first. Beneath the romance of turrets and towers, there was science, quiet, patient, and utterly brilliant. Medieval builders knew the soil's moods. They tested the earth by flooding small trenches with water, watching how it drained. Too fast, the ground was too loose. Too slow, the clay might swell and crack the stones. They listened to the sound of iron rods hammered into the ground. A dull thud meant danger. A ringing echo meant strength. Primitive seismology, centuries before the term existed. Some chose high ridges of limestone for strength. Others picked marshy ground on purpose, hiding wooden piles beneath layers of stone to create a kind of shock-absorbing cushion. Historians still argue whether the builders of Caerphilly Castle in Wales deliberately used floating oak platforms to handle floods. Some believe it was luck. Others call it early engineering genius. If you knelt down and brushed away centuries of moss beneath a ruined wall today, you'd see it, layer upon layer of rough-hewn stone fitted like a puzzle, each layer slightly offset from the last, distributing the weight evenly. No mortar at first, just gravity and geometry. And yet, it worked. There were tricks too, invisible wedges of crushed limestone that expanded slightly with moisture, keeping the castle level even as the ground shifted. In France, some masons mixed sand and egg white into early mortar, believing it added flexibility. Modern tests show they might have been right. Down there, in the cold trench before the first wall rose, every decision meant centuries of endurance or slow collapse. You can almost feel the tension, the engineers working by torchlight, murmuring in Latin, measuring with knotted cords. The castle's soul began underground, silent, invisible, eternal. As you lie there listening, think of how much was decided beneath your feet, the unseen foundation that held entire kingdoms together. The world above might change, but the roots stayed strong. If the foundation was the castle's bones, then water was its nervous system, silent, vital, and everywhere. Tonight, you can almost hear it trickling through hidden pipes, sloshing against stone, echoing faintly underfoot. Because behind every moat and rain spout lay a puzzle solved centuries ahead of its time. Medieval builders didn't just dig ditches for drama. Moats were part defense, part plumbing, and part pressure relief. Some were natural rivers rerouted with astonishing precision, entire watercourses bent around fortress walls. Others were man-made, fed by underground channels and secret sluices that could flood or drain them in hours. In England, at Bodiam Castle, water engineers used a triple channel system, one to fill, one to empty, and one purely to manage overflow. It was elegant, functional, almost hydraulic in sophistication. And yet, if you looked at it from above, it just seemed romantic, a silver ring around the stone crown. Inside the walls, water was both a gift and a threat. Medieval rain was relentless. Without careful design, walls could rot from the inside, mortar could crumble, and floors could warp. So, masons invented what we'd now call hydraulic management. Stone gargoyles spat rain far from walls. Gutters carved into parapets channeled runoff into collection basins. Some castles even had internal drains that ran through hollowed stones beneath the courtyards. There are stories of wells that connected secretly to moats, not to poison enemies, as myths claim, but to regulate pressure and prevent flooding. In Croix de Chevaliers, Syria, engineers carved entire subterranean galleries to store rainwater, a design so advanced that modern hydrologists still study it. Historians still argue whether they intended these reservoirs to double as escape tunnels or were simply over-engineered masterpieces of survival. And while nobles sipped wine in great halls, servants below listened to the eternal drip of captured rain, the heartbeat of the castle itself. It was more than defense, it was endurance. A fortress could fall only when the water stopped flowing. Now picture it. Moonlight on the moat's surface, frogs croaking softly, torchlight reflecting in trembling ripples. You're standing above centuries of engineering, disguised as poetry. And the water, steady and calm, still moves, as if remembering the hands that shaped its path long ago. The drawbridge, that creaking, groaning plank between safety and peril, was more than a symbol of medieval defense. It was a masterpiece of balance, a physics lesson disguised as drama. Imagine standing in the chilled dawn mist, watching the heavy wooden bridge slowly lift as iron chains clank and gears grind. To the untrained eye, it seems like brute strength at work. But in truth, the magic lay in the mathematics hidden behind those wooden beams. Early drawbridges were simple, lifted by hand with ropes and brute force. But over time, castle engineers discovered leverage. They used counterweights, massive stones, or lead blocks hidden inside towers, to balance the bridge's weight so precisely that a single guard could raise or lower it with one hand. At Château de Vincennes in France, the lifting mechanism was so well calibrated that visitors described it as floating up like a feather. Each bridge pivoted on thick oak beams fitted into sockets lined with iron. The secret wasn't strength, it was distribution. By spreading the load evenly and letting the counterweights do the heavy lifting, the system stayed smooth, silent, and almost graceful. Historians still debate whether Italian engineers first perfected the double-chain drawbridge system or if it evolved independently across Europe. The records are murky. Patents didn't exist, and knowledge traveled mouth to ear among guilds of masons and carpenters. Then there were the locks, clever pin systems that allowed bridges to stop midair, locking like a jaw over the moat. Some even had trapdoors built in, just in case someone tried to cross uninvited. And the sound? Oh, that sound. The echo of wood against stone, the rhythmic creak of chains tightening. It was the castle's heartbeat. Guards heard it in their sleep. Nobles relied on it more than prayer. Think of the drawbridge not as an obstacle, but as a conversation between weight and willpower. A small adjustment of iron, and gravity itself became your ally. So next time you see one in a movie, rising with dramatic slowness, remember, it wasn't just a door. It was a perfectly tuned instrument, one that played the music of defense, discipline, and design. You'd think stone walls were silent, solid, and dead, but they weren't. Medieval castle walls were alive. They breathed, not literally, of course, but through a subtle rhythm of temperature, moisture, and air. The masons who built them knew this. though they would never have called it physics or thermodynamics. They simply observed that the stone must rest. That's what they said, let the wall rest, as if it were an animal. When you picture a castle, maybe you see a smooth, gray expanse of stone. In truth, those walls were layered, a sandwich of secrets. The outer face, rough-hewn limestone or granite, was designed to deflect rain and cold. Behind it came a core of smaller stones and rubble mixed with lime mortar, loose enough to flex, tight enough to hold. And between these, tiny cavities formed, pockets of air, spaces for the wall to breathe. By day, sunlight warmed the stone. At night, it cooled. The air inside those tiny gaps moved, slow, invisible drafts that carried away moisture before it could rot the mortar. Without this breath, castles would sweat themselves to death from the inside. Historians still argue whether this was intentional engineering or a happy accident of rough medieval workmanship. But the evidence is strong. In regions where masons packed walls too tightly, rot and cracking were far worse. Now imagine being inside such a wall, dark, damp, alive with faint creaks. Rain trickles through hairline cracks and disappears down hidden channels carved on purpose. These weren't flaws. They were the castle's lungs. When a siege came, these same designs kept fire at bay. Arrows tipped with flame or pots of burning pitch couldn't find a steady grip. The air pockets dispersed heat. The angled stones redirected it. The very breath of the wall protected those within. In winter, fireplaces roared and smoke curled through narrow flues set within the walls. The warmth spread, moving along the stone's inner veins, rising gently through the towers. If you touched the wall near a hearth, you could feel a faint pulse, warmth seeping upward like blood through capillaries. No one wrote manuals for this. No architect penned a treatise titled Thermal Engineering for the Medieval Fortress. And yet, there it was, perfection through intuition. Some castles even included what modern restorers call vent stones, small perforated blocks set high into outer walls, disguised as arrow slits. Their real job wasn't defense, it was air exchange. Fresh wind in, damp air out. A 14th century French chronicle describes a mason who claimed his walls, drank the rain, and exhaled the mist. It sounds poetic, but science quietly nods in agreement. Take Bodiam Castle again. Its inner courtyard feels strangely dry even after rain. Archaeologists found hidden weep holes at the base of its inner walls, perfectly aligned with drainage channels below. Every drop that sneaked inside had somewhere to go. Every breath had somewhere to flow. And the sound, oh, if you could listen close enough, you'd hear it. A faint sighing when wind pressed against the battlements. Air moving through stone. The murmur of life in the walls. It's easy to forget that these were homes, not just fortresses. People slept pressed against those stones. They leaned against them to warm themselves, whispered secrets through cracks, even hid messages inside. There's one curious record from the Tower of London, a letter found centuries later sealed between two layers of masonry. A servant had hidden it there, knowing the wall would protect it longer than any guard could. The air kept it dry for 500 years. Medieval builders didn't talk about breathability or ventilation. They used words like balance and patience. They believed stone had temperament, that if you hurried the mortar's drying, it would rebel, cracking in resentment. So they built slowly. They let the walls sleep before burdening them with towers. They treated architecture like gardening, planting, waiting, nurturing. And somehow it worked. Castles that followed these rhythms, built in harmony with air, sun, and time, stand to this day. Others, rushed or oversealed, crumbled long before the Renaissance. Now, picture yourself inside one. It's late at night. The fire in the great hall has faded to embers. The walls around you are cold to the touch, but not dead. They breathe softly, exhaling the day's warmth into the cool night. You hear the low hiss of the wind sliding past the arrow slits. It feels like the building itself is dreaming. You can relax there, safe inside something that still remembers how to live. A fortress that endures not because it's hard, but because it's alive. You begin your climb. The air grows cooler with each step, and the light fades until only a thin ribbon of sunlight slips through the slit window behind you. The walls close in, the stones curve, and the spiral begins to twist. It feels hypnotic, rhythmic, left foot, right foot, always turning the same way. Always clockwise. That wasn't an accident. It was a choice. A calculated, defensive design. You see, most spiral staircases in medieval castles turn clockwise as they ascend. To a casual visitor, it's just a quirk of architecture. But to an intruder storming upward with sword in hand, it was a nightmare. A right-handed attacker. The overwhelming majority would find his swing cramped by the inner wall, his weapon striking stone before striking flesh. The defender above, however, could strike freely downward, his sword arm on the outer side where there was space to move. Every step favored the home team. You can almost picture it. A defender standing halfway up the spiral, feet planted, waiting. The invader must fight uphill, shoulder twisted, blade restricted. The staircase itself becomes a weapon. Historians still argue whether all clockwise spirals were purely defensive or sometimes ritual. There are rare examples that turn counterclockwise, often in towers built by left-handed lords or masons eager to confuse. One famous case is the staircase of Orford Castle in Suffolk, which reverses direction midway, forcing attackers to reorient mid-battle. Brilliant or eccentric? No one knows for sure. But defense was only half the secret. The other half lay in structure, pure engineering. A spiral staircase isn't just pretty geometry. It's a load-bearing column disguised as sculpture. Each step, called a winder, slots in the wall like a puzzle piece, transferring weight downward and inward. Imagine the pressure. Tons of stone pushing on a narrow core, yet it stands for centuries without cracking. The genius lies in the curve. The spiral distributes the load evenly, just as a shell protects a snail. When you reach the midpoint, look at the steps themselves. They're uneven, deliberately so. The outer edge wider for the foot, the inner edge narrow, forcing careful, deliberate motion. This wasn't bad craftsmanship. It was psychological warfare. Attackers rushing upward would trip or stumble. Defenders descending knew every quirk of the steps. Some castles hid traps in the stairs. Loose stones, sudden drops, small holes filled with sand that would give way under weight. Chronicles from 13th century Germany mention stair snares, built so perfectly that a pursuer could vanish mid-chase. Whether that's true or medieval exaggeration, no one's quite sure. But when you run your hand along those worn, smooth railings, you feel how intimately the stone was shaped to human rhythm. Step, twist, pause, breathe. Then there's the light. Spiral staircases weren't gloomy by accident. The narrow arrow-slit windows carved at every few turns allowed just enough light to create contrast, blinding brightness for someone entering from outside, comforting shadow for those who lived within. Even illumination was a form of strategy. But beyond battle and stone, there's symbolism here too. The endless upward turn, the metaphor of progress, of ascent. Medieval monks saw in the spiral a representation of spiritual journey, rising toward light, turning ever closer to heaven. In some keeps, the stair's final step leads to a chapel door, a quiet joke of design. Fight your way upward, and at the top you'll find God waiting. Still, not every spiral climbs up. Some plunge downward into the underbelly of the keep. Down there, the turns tighten, the air dampens, and the sound of your own breathing bounces from wall to wall. These were escape routes, wine cellars, or sometimes prisons. In certain Norman towers, the downward stairs reverse their twist, this time turning counterclockwise, allowing right-handed guards an advantage against prisoners trying to flee upward. Every direction meant intent. And yet, there's beauty too. Imagine torchlight curling along the inner column, each flame flickering in slow rhythm with the steps. Medieval artists adored the shape so much that illuminated manuscripts often used spirals as decorative borders. The architecture of defense turned into the language of art. Archaeologists studying the stones of Dover Castle found masons' marks spiraling outward along the staircase's central pillar, small chiseled sigils left by workers as signatures or prayers. Some were shaped like suns, others like stars. Perhaps they believed the turning motion itself was sacred, mimicking the motion of the heavens. There's another secret hidden in acoustics. Whisper near the inner column, and your voice will glide upward like smoke. Guides demonstrate it today. A soft word at the base can be heard, faint but distinct at the top. The spiral funnels sound as elegantly as it carries weight. In the Middle Ages, messengers used this trick to communicate between floors, an early intercom, powered only by geometry. And as you continue upward now, step by careful step, you notice how the temperature changes. Warm below from torches and hearths, cool above where wind seeps through arrow slits. The spiral wasn't just defensive or spiritual. It was climatic control, a natural air conditioning column long before such words existed. At the top, you emerge breathless into sunlight. The wind rushes in from the battlements, carrying the scent of moss and old rain. Look down the core. You'll see the spiral twist like a seashell, narrowing into darkness. It's a reminder. Even in an age of swords and superstition, builders understood the language of balance. Each step, each curve, each flicker of light was an equation solved not with numbers, but with instinct. They didn't know calculus, but they knew gravity's moods. They didn't need steel. They had proportion, patience, and prayer. So the next time you see a medieval staircase curling skyward in a ruin, remember, it wasn't merely a way up. It was the spine of the castle, a coiled muscle, a living nerve that carried soldiers, servants, whispers, and dreams. Now pause here on the landing, feel the wind slide through the slit in the wall, and listen. Perhaps the staircase still remembers every footstep it ever carried. Somewhere in the silence of the castle, behind an unassuming tapestry or beneath a stairwell that no one seems to use, a draft of cool air slips through a crack in the stone. If you follow it, you might find the hidden veins of the fortress, the secret passages that linked chambers, towers, and sometimes entire keeps together. You can almost imagine the moment of discovery. A flickering candle, a loose flagstone, a hand brushing along a seam in the wall. The sound of stone sliding, the scent of dust that hasn't been disturbed in centuries. A breath of air older than the room itself. These passages were not fantasy. They were as real as the armor and the moats, though their purposes varied. Escape routes, messenger tunnels, spy corridors, or simply the private paths of servants who had to move unseen. Medieval castles were not just military machines. They were labyrinths of social hierarchy. Lords dined, slept, and schemed in open halls, while dozens of invisible figures carried out the quiet business of keeping the world running behind the walls. Historians often mention the postern doors, small back exits that opened toward forests or ravines. They were narrow, hidden below the line of sight, and could only be unlocked from within. In times of siege, these were lifelines, ways to sneak in supplies or escape under the cover of darkness. Some led directly to riverbanks. Others descended into tunnels that seemed to go nowhere, perhaps meant to confuse invaders who managed to find them. At Dover Castle in England, archaeologists uncovered a honeycomb of medieval tunnels so complex that even the modern surveyors lost orientation. They twist under the cliffs, connecting storerooms, guard posts, and hidden chambers. Historians still argue whether they were originally built for defense or smuggling. And there were the more subtle designs, the ones you wouldn't notice even while standing beside them. Some passages were disguised as chimneys. The shaft would appear solid from below, but halfway up, a horizontal cut allowed a person to slip sideways into another flue. Monks used such routes in religious complexes to move silently during prayer hours, their sandals brushing softly against the stone. Inside castles, secret corridors often ran between the lord's quarters and those of confidants or lovers. In the Château de Chinon, France, an entire suite of hidden staircases connected chambers of royal guests. The courtiers pretended not to know, though everyone did. Discretion, after all, was its own kind of architecture. But how were these tunnels built? Picture it. Workers carving by lamplight, each strike of the chisel muffled by damp cloths to avoid echo. Dust mixed with candle soot, and sometimes the tunnels were so tight that the masons had to crawl backward out of them, dragging the rubble behind. They reinforced the ceilings with oak beams, daubed the walls with lime to reflect light, and used water-soaked leather to keep the air breathable. Some castles even had whisper corridors, narrow, curved tunnels that carried sound perfectly from one end to another. A person could stand in one chamber and hear every word whispered in another, 100 feet away. The castle at Conwy in Wales is famous for this. It was a spy's dream and a noble's nightmare. You can almost hear it, the faint echo of a conversation meant to stay private, carried softly through stone. Are they coming? Not yet. Then silence. Historians love to romanticize these things, but they were practical too. In winter, when the outer courtyards froze solid, the passages offered warmth and protection from wind. Servants could move between kitchens and chambers without braving snow. Many corridors doubled as air ducts, venting smoke and bringing in fresh air, an elegant blend of secrecy and engineering. Still, not all were safe. Over centuries, forgotten tunnels collapsed or flooded. Explorers who crawl through ruins today sometimes find half-filled shafts leading into nothingness. The air becomes stale, and the silence grows heavy. It's as if the castle itself has grown tired of sharing its secrets. And then there are the legends. Beneath Edinburgh Castle, locals whisper of tunnels that lead all the way to the city below. Musicians were once sent to explore them, playing bagpipes so the people above could follow the sound. Halfway through, the music stopped. The piper was never found. Modern excavations have never proven the story, but it's told so often that you half expect to hear faint music if you stand there at dusk. Hidden corridors existed everywhere, from France's Loire Valley to Japan's Himeji Castle. Cultures separated by oceans arrived at the same idea: safety, privacy, escape. To build one was to admit that even stone walls could betray you, that the true fortress was movement, not immobility. Imagine now that you're in one of those tunnels. The ceiling is low, you must bow your head. The air smells faintly of damp and oil. A single torch casts uneven shadows ahead. The passage curves, then narrows. Your footsteps echo softly, then fade. You touch the wall and feel the ancient chills seep into your skin. For centuries, footsteps have followed this same route. Nobles, spies, fugitives, all breathing the same recycled air, all trusting this narrow vein of darkness to deliver them. Maybe you find a wooden door at the end, reinforced with iron bands. Or maybe it just stops abruptly, filled in with rubble centuries ago. You wonder who sealed it, and why. The hidden corridors of medieval castles were not mere curiosities. They were the nervous system of a living organism. They carried breath, sound, and human intent through the stone body of the fortress. Each tunnel told a story of fear, of love, of ingenuity. And when you stand in the ruins today, there's still a faint sense that the walls remember the people who passed unseen through their hearts. If you close your eyes, you might hear the faint scrape of a hidden latch, or a sigh of air escaping through cracks, like the castle whispering one last secret. Every stone in a medieval castle tells a story, but not all those stories were meant to be understood by everyone. Some were messages, written in the secret language of the masons. Hidden codes carved into walls, arches, and stairwells, marks so small that most visitors would never notice them. Yet for those who knew the craft, they were as clear as signatures on a masterpiece. You might imagine these builders as rough men with hammers, but they were mathematicians, alchemists, and dreamers in disguise. They held geometry as sacred. To them, the act of shaping stone wasn't just construction, it was creation almost divine. A castle wasn't built only for kings. It was built for God, for harmony, for the perfection of form. And so, they left their signs. Walk into any medieval keep, say, the Tower of London or the Fortress of Carcassonne, and if you look closely, you'll see them, little chiseled patterns. A sunburst, a triangle, a looping spiral like a snail shell. Sometimes just an odd mark resembling a rune. For centuries, historians assumed these were ownership symbols or team identifiers. Each group of masons, they thought, marked their work to claim wages. But the deeper we look, the stranger it gets. Some of the marks appear aligned along invisible grids, lines of geometry that repeat across arches, buttresses, and doorways. It's as if the masons were mapping energy, not just space. A few modern researchers believe these tracing lines encoded proportions based on sacred geometry, ratios found in Gothic cathedrals and even ancient temples. The square and the circle, the triangle and the arc. They weren't random doodles. They were formulas in stone. Historians still argue whether the knowledge came from the East, perhaps passed along by crusaders who encountered Islamic architects, or whether it was preserved through secret guilds that stretched back to Roman times. The truth hides somewhere between myth and mathematics. And then there were the symbols of faith disguised as geometry. 5-pointed stars for protection. Interlocking circles representing eternity. The vesica piscis, that almond-shaped form found in church windows, also appears in some castle doorways. To the uninitiated, it's decoration. To the masons, it was a sacred measure, the intersection of heaven and earth. One chronicler from the 14th century wrote of a builder's covenant, a ritual held at night, where new apprentices were taught not with books but with compasses, string, and shadows cast by a single candle. They learned how to find the perfect right angle using only 3 knotted cords, a lesson older than any kingdom they served. The guild guarded its secrets fiercely. To reveal the inner geometry to outsiders could mean exile, or worse, eternal shame. In a way, castles were coded manuscripts carved in limestone. Each pattern of vaults and pillars whispered in proportion. The placement of a tower wasn't random. Followed the golden ratio, though medieval builders would never have called it that. They spoke of divine measure. The same ratio that appears in shells and flowers guided their walls. When a visitor entered the great hall and felt awe, it wasn't only because of the scale. It was because every angle, every line, resonated with the quiet order of the natural world. But symbols went beyond geometry. Builders also left jokes, prayers, even confessions etched into mortar joints. In an abbey in Yorkshire, a mason scratched a tiny figure of himself holding a mallet, as if immortalizing a wink across time. In the ruins of a Scottish keep, someone carved a small fish next to a window, perhaps marking the day's meal, perhaps a secret emblem of faith during troubled times. At Warwick Castle, restorers discovered a set of concentric circles carved near the hearth, a witch mark, intended to trap evil spirits before they could enter through the chimney. The line between superstition and engineering blurred easily in those centuries. The Masons saw no contradiction between mathematics and magic. Both spoke of harmony. Both were ways to shape chaos into order. And perhaps the most mysterious of all are the cathedral fingerprints, the deliberate misalignments. Slightly tilted stones, off-center carvings. You'd think they were mistakes, but they repeat too often to be accidental. One theory suggests that Masons introduced minor imperfections to remind themselves that only God could achieve true perfection. Each flaw, then, was an act of humility written in stone. Imagine a day on the scaffolding, ropes creaking, wind whipping across the battlements, and the smell of mortar and sweat. A young apprentice climbs up to deliver tools. His master takes a chisel and, before fitting the next block, scratches a tiny cross or a spiral. For balance, he says. But balance between what? Earth and sky, man and God. The secret dies with him. Yet the mark remains, silent proof that knowledge was passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. In that way, castles are like memory palaces. Each tower, stairwell, and gate encodes more than defense. It encodes a worldview. Geometry, faith, humility, and defiance all wrapped in stone. When you walk through a castle today, you're not just moving through architecture. You're moving through a sacred code, a frozen ritual of meaning. Now, take a moment. Picture yourself running your fingers along a cold wall in candlelight. You find a small mark, just a shallow curve. Maybe a mason's letter, maybe an ancient equation. You'll never know for sure. But for a second, you feel connected across 8 centuries to someone who stood right there, breathing the same damp air, leaving a message for no one and everyone at once. And if you listen closely, the silence seems to hum with geometry. The music of stone shaped by human hands that understood how even walls could carry secrets deeper than any spoken word. When you step into a medieval castle's chapel or great hall, your eyes instinctively rise. It's a reaction older than reason. You follow the line of the walls up, past banners and sconces, until the ceiling blooms above like a stone forest. Ribs of rock meet in flowering intersections. Light catches on edges carved centuries ago. The whole thing feels too delicate to exist, and yet it has stood for nearly a millennium. The secret behind that miracle is the arch, the vault, the pure poetry of weight tamed by geometry. Before the Middle Ages, builders stacked stone straight up, trusting thickness over intellect. But medieval engineers learned something that changed architecture forever. Stone could float, if you taught it how to redirect its own burden. The pointed arch became their revelation. Unlike the heavy Roman semicircle, the pointed Gothic arch sent weight sideways and down, not straight to the earth. This meant walls could grow taller, thinner, lighter. And suddenly, castles and cathedrals alike could breathe light instead of darkness. A structural choice became a kind of spiritual awakening. Now imagine the mason's world. No calculators, no blueprints, only string, chalk, and prayer. Each stone had to fit perfectly, or the arch would collapse before it reached completion. To build a vault, workers erected a wooden frame, called centering, that supported each block as it was laid. Only when the final keystone was tapped into place did the miracle happen. The wood was removed, and the weight became balance. The stones leaned on one another like friends, each preventing the other from falling. There's beauty in that idea, the notion that strength is born not from isolation, but from interdependence. At Durham Cathedral in England, the earliest ribbed vaults from the 11th century already hint at genius. The ribs weren't just decoration. They distributed stress across the ceiling, creating webs of strength that looked like lacework. In France, master builders refined the idea until ribs crossed and multiplied, making the ceilings dance. What began as function turned into art. Historians still argue who first perfected the ribbed vault, Normans or French masons. The evidence blurs in the dust of centuries, but perhaps it doesn't matter. The style spread across Europe like fire catching on dry grass. Inside castles, vaults served practical purposes too. Barrel vaults beneath great halls made ideal storerooms, cool, strong, and resistant to fire. The air moved slowly down there, preserving grain and wine. Even the acoustics mattered. A rounded vault amplified sound, carrying footsteps or whispers across the space. Some builders designed it that way deliberately. Lords could hear conspiracies from across the hall. The Great Keep of Chateau de Vincennes hides one of the most sophisticated vault systems ever built for a fortress. Each rib and joint was designed to draw moisture away from the ceiling, using gravity as plumbing. Beneath the beauty, the science hummed quietly. And beauty it was. Builders began adding carved bosses at the intersections of ribs, small sculptures of leaves, beasts, or angels. These weren't random decoration. They marked the invisible math underneath, the crossing points where forces met in perfect equilibrium. Each carving was both ornament and equation, a fusion of soul and science. The idea of the stone that floats fascinated everyone. Chronicles tell of nobles who would stand beneath a fresh vault, terrified that it might collapse, until the master, mason, walked calmly to the center and clapped his hands, proof of faith in geometry. When one vault fell during construction in Beauvais, The builders simply rebuilt it taller. Failure was part of progress. Inside fortresses, engineers applied the same principles in humbler ways. Over doorways and windows, small pointed arches spread the load, keeping walls from cracking. In underground passages, barrel vaults carried tons of soil without a whisper of strain. Even prison cells had gentle curves in the ceilings, not for beauty, but because a flat slab would have split under pressure. One curiosity remains: the inverted vaults found in some wells and cisterns. Builders flipped the principle upside down, carving arches that pointed downward to resist the upward thrust of water. It was counterintuitive, ingenious, and it worked. Some of these subterranean vaults still hold rainwater from the Middle Ages. You can almost feel the awe that workers must have felt when the wooden scaffolds came down. Imagine it. The long silence after weeks of hammering, dust settling, torches dimming. Then, the faint creak as the arch took its own weight for the first time. And nothing moved. A new space was born, floating, silent, eternal. There's something meditative about standing beneath one now. The world above could roar with storms, yet inside, the air feels hushed like the inside of a shell. You can trace the ribs upward with your eyes, follow their branching lines until they vanish into the dim light. The stone seems to breathe. You might even feel your heartbeat slowing to match the rhythm of the place. Some scholars argue that these designs influenced music itself, the repetition and harmony of notes inspired by the geometry of vaults. Others think the opposite, that architecture borrowed rhythm from chant. Either way, the connection between structure and sound, between math and emotion, became inseparable. And if you ever visit an old ruin, stand in the remnants of a collapsed hall, look at the broken ribs above, and remember, each of those pieces once belonged to an equation so perfect that it could make gravity behave like grace. Because that's what those builders really did. They didn't defy physics, they befriended it. They learned that beauty isn't the absence of weight, it's the mastery of it. The vault was the breath of the castle made visible, a whisper in stone saying, "I understand how the world falls, and I know how to rise against it." Now lean back, close your eyes, and imagine that arched ceiling above you, curving like a night sky, holding you safe beneath centuries of quiet perfection. If you wandered through a medieval castle without knowing its secrets, you might think it was simply a place of grandeur: arched windows, patterned floors, carved stone creatures leering down from ledges. But every elegant flourish hid something else: function, purpose, survival. The architects of these fortresses were not only artists but illusionists. They hid their sharpest blades behind beauty. Every doorway, window, and corridor was a chess move in stone, designed to delay, confuse, or destroy anyone who came uninvited. Let's start with something innocent-looking: the arrow slit. At first glance, it's a narrow vertical window, barely wider than a man's hand. Light streams in. You could mistake it for decoration. But from the inside, the slit widens dramatically, forming a deep triangular cavity. That shape gave archers inside the range to aim almost anywhere while exposing only an inch of their bodies to the outside. Now, imagine being on the wrong side of that wall. You'd see nothing but a black slit. You'd have no idea where the next arrow would come from. Some are even angled downward, allowing defenders to shoot at the very base of the wall, perfect for stopping attackers planting ladders. Historians still debate who first invented this trick: the Normans, or perhaps earlier Islamic architects whose fortresses in the Levant used similar designs. Knowledge, like wind, flowed between crusades and trade routes. Whatever the origin, the idea spread across Europe faster than the stories of dragons and saints. But arrow slits were only the beginning. Some fortresses disguised murder holes, small square openings in ceilings above gateways. When invaders breached the first doors, defenders would rain boiling oil, stones, or even sand from above. Sand sounds innocent, but when heated, it clings to armor, burning through cloth and flesh alike. Engineers angled the holes so that nothing could be thrown upward in return. Then there were false doors. You might run toward what looks like an escape, only to find yourself trapped in a tiny chamber, sealed from both sides. In some castles, those dead-end rooms had slots in the ceiling where guards could drop arrows or smoke grenades. A corridor that looked welcoming could suddenly become a tomb. In Bodiam Castle, staircases were deliberately uneven, some steps shorter, some taller, to trip unfamiliar feet. The defenders who lived there knew the rhythm by heart. The invaders, racing blindly in armor, would stumble. It's subtle, brutal psychology. Even the walls themselves could deceive. Builders varied the color of stones to create shadows that concealed small protrusions, handholds only visible to those who knew where to look. Servants and soldiers could scale hidden routes during emergencies, while outsiders saw only flat stone. And the gates, a masterpiece of mechanical theater. Behind the heavy wooden doors was the portcullis, a grid iron gate that dropped vertically from grooves in the ceiling. Once lowered, it could pin a man in place like an insect. The real trick, though, was in the timing. Many castles used double gates, one at the outer wall, another inside, creating a narrow courtyard between them called the killing zone. The moment enemies poured through the first gate, the outer one slammed down behind them. Arrows, stones, and boiling water poured in from slits on all sides. The invaders had nowhere to go but down. And yet, all of this was invisible to the casual eye. You'd stroll through a courtyard, admire a gargoyle, and not realize that its hollow mouth once channeled flammable oil. You'd lean on a balcony railing unaware that it doubled as a hidden gutter, carrying water or blood away from the fight below. Medieval architect had a word for this kind of design: cunning work. They believed that cleverness was as noble a weapon as courage. Strength without strategy was foolishness. So they built layers of deception, each trick disguised beneath beauty. In the French fortress of Château Gallard, designed by Richard the Lionheart himself, the outer walls appear randomly curved and broken. It looks chaotic, but each curve is calculated to deflect incoming projectiles. When trebuchets hurled stones, the angles sent them glancing away instead of hitting straight on. A jagged wall turned out to be stronger than a smooth one. In the castles of Spain, you'll find tiled mosaics that seem decorative but conceal patterns of weak mortar, intentionally placed to collapse small sections of wall during siege, blocking tunnels or sealing breaches. A self-healing defense. The beauty of geometry doubled as trap. Even sound played a role. Narrow corridors and domed ceilings amplified footsteps, making 10 soldiers sound like 50. Wooden floors were built with hollow spaces beneath, so that the weight of armored boots would creak loudly, an early alarm system that needed no bells. Think, too, of the moats, often portrayed as mere water barriers. In truth, many were filled with thorns, spikes, or quicklime, a chemical that burned through skin. Others were dry altogether, carved as deep trenches with slanted sides impossible to climb. And yet, walking through such places now, centuries after their purpose has faded, the atmosphere feels peaceful. The tricks of war have become the poetry of ruin. Sunlight filters through arrow slits like cathedral windows. Moss grows where soldiers once stood, ready to pour fire. You can still feel the intelligence in the stone, the quiet smile of an engineer who outsmarted death. Some say these architects were the first psychologists. They studied fear and anticipation as much as mortar and masonry. They understood that war was as much about perception as power. If an enemy felt watched, trapped, or confused, the battle was half won before the swords ever crossed. You can almost hear that lesson whispered through time. Make beauty your armor and intelligence your shield. So next time you see a castle, its towers serene against a blue sky, remember that beneath every elegant curve lies calculation. Beneath every carving, a secret. Every stone was once part of a living defense, graceful and merciless in equal measure. And tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, imagine walking those halls alone, the echoes of your footsteps blending with the memory of thousands before you. The walls feel kind, the air calm, but somewhere, hidden in the shadow of an archway, the castle still watches, ready to protect, to deceive, to endure. The idea of comfort inside a medieval castle might seem laughable. Cold stone floors, sooty fires, armor clanking in the corridors. You'd imagine an existence of drafty misery and, well, smell. But behind the rough image of the Middle Ages, there was astonishing ingenuity, an early science of sanitation, quietly at work in stone. Because, yes, those people had plumbing. Crude by modern standards, yes, but clever enough to make life bearable and sometimes surprisingly pleasant. Let's start with the most human problem: waste. Most castles had garderobes, stone toilets built into the thickness of outer walls. They weren't random holes in rock. Each one was carefully designed to slope outward, letting gravity handle the unmentionable. At the base of the chute, engineers sometimes directed running water, draining waste into moats or pits below. It was primitive, yet efficient. In the 13th century, Dover Castle had a whole block of garderobes stacked one above another, with vertical shafts carved through the wall like chimneys. The waste dropped straight down into channels that carried it away. Stone masons smoothed those shafts with plaster to prevent buildup, an early anti-stick coating centuries before Teflon. And the smell? They thought of that too. Garderobe doors often opened to small exterior balconies, allowing airflow to whisk odors away. Some castles even built vent towers, tall stone ducts beside kitchens and latrines to create a suction effect as warm air rose. Engineers didn't call it ventilation science, but it was. Still, not all castles were equal. Wealthier ones experimented with luxury. Edward I's palace at the Tower of London featured flushing toilets, a tank of water stored above the seat, emptied by pulling a lever. The flush washed everything into the Thames. Effective, if not environmentally sound. Bathing, contrary to myth, wasn't rare. The medieval obsession with purity extended far beyond religion. Monks bathed weekly, nobles twice or thrice a week, and even soldiers sometimes used communal baths during sieges. Large tubs of heated water were hauled into chambers, often scented with herbs, mint, lavender, or rosemary. A servant poured warmed water through spouts connected to copper pipes hidden behind the walls. At Carcassonne, archaeologists found lead and clay conduits running beneath floors, evidence of heated plumbing. Some chambers even had primitive floor heating, with hot air from kitchen fires channeled through hollow bricks beneath the flagstones. The idea was borrowed from ancient Rome and quietly revived. The same technology that kept emperors warm now comforted kings. Historians still argue whether such systems were widespread or reserved for elites. In smaller castles, water was drawn manually from wells, sometimes more than 100 feet deep. Engineers lined these shafts with chalk or brick to prevent contamination, and some wells connected directly to rainwater cisterns hidden beneath courtyards. Cleverly, these cisterns were domed, not flat, ensuring sediment settled at the edges. Clean water stayed in the center. The kitchens, meanwhile, were laboratories of controlled fire and steam. They had built-in drains carved directly into the floor, running into underground stone channels. Grease traps made of clay slowed the flow to prevent blockages. And the cooks used ash, a natural degreaser, to scrub pots and pans. Modern soap's ancestor. One eccentric curiosity. In Scotland's Craigmillar Castle, there's a small chamber labeled the Laird's Lavatory. It features both a toilet and a tiny fireplace. Historians think it was a private comfort room where the Lord could relieve himself while keeping warm, a medieval luxury suite. The flue from a fireplace also helped draw air upward through the waste chute. Two functions, one elegant design. Medieval people understood the dangers of stagnant water. They used running streams whenever possible, diverting flow through pipes or wooden conduits to kitchens and baths. In some fortresses, lead pipes carried spring water for miles away. Harlech Castle in Wales used a gravity-fed system so advanced that engineers could refill the cisterns even during siege. They also practiced what we now call gray water recycling. Water used for washing dishes or clothes was collected in basins and redirected to flush latrines. Some monks even filtered it through layers of sand and charcoal, a crude but effective purification technique. The goal wasn't luxury. It was sustainability before the word existed. And what is soap? In England and France, soap-making guilds were already active by the 12th century. Their secret: animal fat boiled with lime made from wood ash. A castle laundry room smelled faintly of smoke and tallow, but it worked. Linen shirts were scrubbed, rinsed in lime water, and hung in breezy courtyards to bleach under sunlight. Even personal hygiene held its rituals. Wooden combs, bone toothpicks, and mouth rinses made with wine or vinegar appear in castle inventories. Some ladies used rose water for perfume, not just vanity, but also mild antiseptic. And barbers doubled as surgeons, trimming hair one day and lancing abscesses the next. Still, not everything worked as intended. Some garderobe chutes emptied straight into moats, which doubled as sewage ponds. During sieges, when waste couldn't be disposed of, conditions turned unbearable. Chronicles described garrisons forced to sleep above rising fumes, praying the wind stayed kind. But ingenuity persisted. Engineers built lime pits at the base of chutes to neutralize waste. Lime's chemical reaction produced heat, killing bacteria without anyone knowing the science behind it. They learned by trial, not theory, but the results were real. One French mason left a note etched in stone: "If the nose suffers, the wall has failed." It was practical poetry, and it summarized an entire philosophy. By the late 15th century, hygiene had become a mark of civility. Castles began including private washing rooms, tiled in bright mosaics, with running water from elevated tanks. Hot air ducts ran behind walls to dry the chambers after use. The line between fortress and palace blurred, defense meeting decadence. So, the next time someone claims medieval people lived in filth, remember, beneath the armor and stone, they were engineers of necessity, innovators of cleanliness. Their systems were invisible but alive, pipes gurgling, water trickling, fires warming, all bound together by curiosity and common sense. Picture it now: torchlight gleaming on damp stone, a faint trickle echoing from a hidden drain. Somewhere, a servant hauls a bucket of steaming water toward a wooden tub. A gust of warm air rises through a vent, carrying the scent of mint. 1,000 years ago, comfort wasn't absent, it was simply carved by hand. The first thing you'd notice, stepping into a medieval castle in winter, is the cold. It wasn't gentle. It was a presence, seeping into your boots, biting your fingertips, creeping behind your ribs like an uninvited ghost. The walls didn't merely contain the chill, they radiated it. Yet somehow, people lived, laughed, plotted, and sang inside these fortresses for centuries. They had no central heating, no insulation, no glass panes to trap warmth. But what they did have was ingenuity, patience, and fire. The heart of every castle was its hearth. Massive fireplaces dominated the great halls, their mouths wide enough for a grown man to stand inside. Flames roared day and night, fueled by entire logs the size of small trees. The smoke billowed upward into immense chimneys that acted as both ventilation and rudimentary heating ducts. The closer you stood to the fire, the warmer you felt. Take 2 steps away, and frost claimed your breath again. But the builders knew how to make the heat travel. They learned to carve shallow flues, hidden passages inside the walls, that carried warm air upward to the floors above. These flues were like arteries of warmth, distributing faint heat into bedchambers and corridors. Some castles, especially in France and Germany, included what we'd now call hypocaust systems, borrowed from Roman bathhouses. Fires built in small basement chambers forced hot air through clay pipes beneath the floors. You could walk barefoot on certain tiles in winter and feel the earth gently humming beneath you. At Dover Castle, archaeologists found one such system, a network of stone ducts leading from the kitchens to nearby chambers, cleverly doubling as both heat source and venting channel. The masons even placed thin slate tiles atop those ducts to spread the warmth evenly. The air circulation wasn't perfect, but it made the difference between shivering and surviving. Historians still argue whether these systems were deliberate inventions or rediscoveries of Roman designs long forgotten. Either way, they show something remarkable. Medieval builders didn't see fire merely as flame. They saw it as energy, something that could be guided, shaped, and tamed. Fireplaces themselves became art. In early castles, they were simple pits, smoky and inefficient. But by the 13th century, masons began angling their backs and sides to reflect heat forward, like natural mirrors. The inner stones were often polished or coated with lime to bounce the warmth across the hall. Some even included small smoke hoods or chambers that trapped heat before releasing it upward. At the same time, chimneys evolved from luxury to necessity. Before chimneys, smoke had to escape through roof vents or louvered openings, leaving rooms dark and blackened. With chimneys, castles could have multiple fires burning at once, each venting safely. Imagine walking through a keep at dusk, faint ribbons of smoke rising from a dozen narrow towers, each marking a family or servant sleeping warmer that night. Still, wood was precious. Entire forests were felled to keep castles warm. Engineers began designing heat traps, small stone alcoves built beside main fireplaces, sealed by curtains or wooden screens. People sat within these cozy niches to absorb the heat directly. The thick masonry retained warmth even after the fire went out, creating pockets of comfort in an otherwise freezing world. Tapestries served a double purpose too. Beyond their beauty, they insulated the walls. Heavy fabrics lined with wool or linen absorbed drafts, turning cold chambers into softer, quieter places. Some were so large they stretched from ceiling to floor, embroidered with hunting scenes, saints, or astrological symbols. Visual warmth echoing the physical. And then there were braziers, metal bowls filled with hot coals, carried from room to room like portable suns. They glowed red in the dark, crackling softly as servants fed them. But they were dangerous. A single overturned brazier could burn down an entire wing. So castles were dotted with stone platforms or sand pits where they could safely stand, glowing like patient hearts scattered through the night. One of the most fascinating heating inventions was the corner flue. Builders discovered that if they placed chimneys diagonally through two adjoining rooms, the heat would radiate into both spaces. The same fire could warm multiple chambers, an early form of energy efficiency. Some of these diagonal chimneys even met in the middle, combining smoke into a single grand vent that rose like a spinal column through the castle's core. In the kitchens, heat was life. Fires never died there. Cooks tended them like sacred altars. Some kitchens had 4 or 5 separate hearths, one for boiling, one for baking, one for roasting, one for brewing. The warmth bled through the stone into corridors and servants' quarters. It wasn't luxurious, but it was steady. You could always find warmth if you followed the scent of bread and smoke. Even the placement of rooms reflected an understanding of warmth. Private chambers were built above kitchens, where rising heat naturally gathered. Cold storage rooms were sunk below ground. In some castles, staircases were deliberately coiled beside chimney shafts so that warm air followed the climber upward. Comfort wasn't an afterthought. It was an invisible map, written into the very bones of the building. The sounds of heating shaped castle life too. The low crackle of logs, the sighing of wind through vents, the occasional boom of air expanding inside a flue. It all created a rhythm, a living pulse that made stone seem alive. Children whispered stories by the fire, servants dozed against warm walls, and guards leaned near chimneys on long, frozen nights, listening to the fortress breathe with them. Of course, not everything went smoothly. Chimneys clogged, smoke backed up, and fires escaped into thatched roofs. Some builders began lining flues with glazed clay to reduce sparks, the ancestor of modern chimney tiles. When a castle survived its first few winters without burning down, it was considered blessed by divine favor. And yet, for all their labor, warmth remained a luxury. Most people in a castle, servants, guards, workers, slept in unheated rooms. They layered straw on the floor and wrapped themselves in wool or fur. Some even shared beds to trap body heat, a custom both practical and social. Still, the Great Hall always glowed. That was the center, the heart of stone, the place where warmth gathered and light flickered against high beams. If you stood there at midnight, hearing the fire whisper and the walls creak, you might think the whole building was breathing in slow, smoky rhythm, inhaling heat, exhaling history. It's a quiet marvel, the way something so ancient, so simple, fire guided through stone, could turn a cold fortress into a home. And as you imagine it now, the warmth of that distant fire might seep through the centuries toward you. The flames crackle softly. The air hums. Even the stones remember what it felt like to be warm. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself standing in the great hall of a medieval castle. It's empty now, long after the feast. The torches have burned low, and only the echo of your footsteps remains. Yet somehow the sound seems alive, lingering, stretching, weaving through the arches. You take another step, and the air itself responds. The walls are listening. This was no accident. The men who designed these fortresses understood something subtle and profound: the way sound moved through stone. They didn't have modern acoustics or decibel meters, but they had centuries of instinct and observation. They learned that space could speak, that the shape of a room could command silence or amplify it into thunder. In the largest halls, voices carried astonishingly well. A noble seated at one end could hear a servant whisper at the other. Builders achieved this by using gently curved ceilings and slightly concave walls, architectural features that reflected sound toward the center. A great hall was not merely a room for eating, it was a stage for power. Every cough, every murmur, every clink of a goblet became part of a symphony of authority. When a lord spoke, the room itself made his words large. Some of this knowledge came from churches. Gothic architects had already discovered that ribbed vaults and pointed arches could carry the sound of a chant all the way to the furthest pew. Castle builders, often trained in those same guilds, borrowed the techniques. But unlike churches, castles had multiple moods to accommodate: the solemnity of a court, the secrecy of a council, the laughter of a feast. So the engineers experimented. They used timber ceilings in smaller chambers to absorb noise and prevent echo. They hung tapestries not only for warmth, but also to dampen sound. A whisper in a bedchamber stayed private. A command in the throne room carried like prophecy. In the corridors, however, acoustics served a darker purpose. Long, narrow passageways acted as natural amplifiers. A single set of approaching footsteps could echo like an army's march, warning guards long before an intruder appeared. Spiral staircases twisted sound upward, letting those above hear anyone ascending from below. In a sense, the castle was an enormous instrument, each space tuned for a particular purpose. Historians still argue whether some of this was deliberate or simply serendipity, but the patterns are too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Builders experimented with materials, mixing lime, straw, and crushed shells in a plaster for its subtle softness, or using sandstone for its bright echo. They even paid attention to temperature and moisture. Damp air softened sound, while cold, dry nights made voices travel farther. Some of the most fascinating evidence comes from so-called whispering galleries, rare circular rooms where sound travels perfectly along the walls. You can stand at one side, speak in a normal tone, and someone on the opposite side will hear you as clearly as if you were beside them. The phenomenon is caused by concave geometry, which reflects sound waves in a continuous path. The most famous example today is in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, but similar effects existed centuries earlier in castle towers. There's a story, half legend, half truth, about a medieval queen who discovered her husband's infidelity through such a wall. The servants whispered in what they thought was privacy, but their words traveled like ghosts through stone, winding their way to her ears in another chamber. Whether or not the tale is true, it reflects a very real mystery. In castles, even silence could betray you. Acoustics shape daily life in ways subtle and grand. Trumpets signaling the change of guard had to be heard across thick walls, so courtyards were designed as echo chambers. The square proportions and high battlements multiplied sound, making a single horn blast carry over valleys. In wartime, those echoes could mean survival. Inside, musicians adapted to the architecture. The lute, soft and intimate, belonged in smaller chambers. The pipe and drum filled the halls. Minstrels learned where to stand, beneath the arch or beside the hearth, to make their songs bloom with warmth. In some castles, there were small alcoves built into the walls just for musicians, their openings carved like mouths in the stone. The sound that emerged was softened, dreamlike, as if the building itself were singing. But acoustics weren't only for music and command. They also provided comfort. In the stillness of night, when the wind howled and fires dimmed, the hum of sound within the walls became almost alive. The crackle of torches, the faint creak of timbers, the sigh of wind through arrow slits. These were lullabies in an age without engines or electric hum. For those who lived their lives surrounded by silence and stone, those small sounds became companionship. And in the quiet corners of these fortresses, acoustics played yet another role: devotion. Chapels built within castles had perfect resonance. Monks and priests could chant softly, and their prayers would fill the air like mist, wrapping the congregation in sound. Listeners described it as if the air itself were praying back. In some places, strange designs suggest that masons were experimenting consciously with sound. Curved niches, hollow columns, and even empty cavities hidden behind altars, all possibly resonators. Were they meant to enhance the voice or to hold it, echoing long after the words ended? Historians still debate it, but it's easy to believe these builders heard something sacred in the union of sound and stone. One traveler in the 15th century wrote of sleeping in a hall where he could hear the walls breathing. He probably meant the soft moan of wind through the masonry gaps, but the image remains perfect. The castle itself seemed alive, a giant organism of sound. Imagine now that you're back in that great hall. The fire has burned down to embers. The last echoes of laughter from the feast are fading into the rafters. You whisper something, a word, a name, and it returns to you, faint but unmistakable. The stone answers. It's the sound of time itself lingering, refusing to vanish. The whispering walls carry not just words, but memory. Every shout, every song, every secret ever spoken still vibrates somewhere deep within the stone, waiting for someone quiet enough to listen. And maybe, if you stay still long enough, you'll hear them. The murmur of history, the lullaby of centuries, softly rocking you to sleep beneath the castle's patient breath. In the quiet center of every fortress, past the clamor of gates and courtyards, beyond the kitchens and the armories, there was always one thing, simple, silent, and vital. A circle of darkness carved into stone. The well. It may not look like much, just a shaft in the earth, ringed with rope grooves and worn hands of countless generations. But in truth, it was the heart that kept the castle alive. No moat, no wall, no garrison could matter if the well failed. When a fortress lost its water, it lost its soul. Picture the scene. You're standing in a courtyard, sunlight gleaming on armor and banners. Somewhere nearby, a pulley creaks as a bucket rises from the depths, droplets glinting like silver rain. That sound, the rhythmic squeak of rope and wheel, was the heartbeat of the medieval stronghold. It pulsed day and night. Water was everything. Life, defense, purity, comfort. Yet building a well inside a fortress was no simple feat. Some castles stood atop high ridges or volcanic cliffs, where groundwater was far below. To reach it, engineers dug down hundreds of feet through solid rock, working by torchlight, suspended by ropes, chiseling inch by inch. It was work so dangerous that men wrote prayers on the walls as they descended, calling on saints to protect them from collapse or flooding. At Chateau Gallard, the engineers pierced through 120 feet of limestone. At Harlech Castle in Wales, they went nearly 200. Some shafts were so deep that the echo of a dropped stone could take a full 4 seconds to return. And yet they persisted. Why? Because water was survival. In times of peace, it fed the kitchens and filled the baths. In times of siege, it determined who would live and who would die. The best wells were built at the castle's center, protected by thick walls and often covered with a roof or stone house. That way, even if the enemy breached the outer gates, the lifeline remained safe. Some were hidden altogether, accessible only through trapdoors or tunnels so narrow a single bucket could pass through. Engineers learned to line the shafts with layers of stone, fitted tightly without mortar so that groundwater could seep through naturally filtered rock. The clarity of castle water often astonished travelers. Chroniclers describe it as cold as winter and pure as crystal. Some even claimed it had healing properties, a superstition that, in truth, reflected its rarity. Clean water was a miracle, but there were risks. Dig too deep, and poisonous gases could collect. Dig too shallow, and the well might dry during drought. Builders tested their depth by listening. They would lower a burning candle into the shaft. If it went out, there was danger of suffocating air. So they waited. They watched the flame dance. They learned patience. Historians still debate how medieval engineers located water sources in the first place. Some records mention diviners, so-called water witches, using forked hazel branches that bent toward hidden springs. Others insist on practical knowledge. They studied the slope of the land, the moisture of moss, the migration of frogs. Perhaps it was both, intuition sharpened by necessity. There's beauty in the way wells were built to blend with daily life. In large castles, they were social centers. Servants gossiped there. Children played around the stone rim. Sometimes, the Lord himself would draw the first bucket at the start of spring, a symbolic gesture of renewal. The water wasn't just survival, it was ritual. But beneath that surface simplicity lay secret engineering. Many wells had 2 openings, one above for buckets and another below, connecting to underground channels that carried runoff away. This prevented stagnation and contamination. Some even used small wooden valves, allowing flow in only one direction. Without such designs, the castle risked turning its lifeline into a cesspool. There were darker uses too. In wartime, wells became tools of desperation. Invaders poisoned them with carcasses or lime. Defenders collapsed them to prevent capture. Chronicles from the 100 Years' War tell of castles surrendering not for lack of walls, but for lack of water. The bucket came up dry, one writer noted, and with it came despair. To prevent such fate, clever builders sometimes disguised secondary wells within the thickness of the walls or beneath chapels. At Croc de Chevaliers in Syria, the Hospitallers constructed a well that connected directly to vast cisterns carved into the mountain. Rainwater collected through hidden gutters, feeding the tanks even when enemies cut off the springs. The castle could survive for years, locked away from the world. Some of these cisterns were masterpieces of hydraulic engineering. Vaulted ceilings prevented collapse, while layers of sand and charcoal purified the inflow. The sound of dripping water inside was said to echo like music, slow, rhythmic, endless. Pilgrims called it the song of survival. And then there's the poetry of it all, the symbolism that ran deeper than the stone. Medieval writers often compared wells to the soul. A castle without a well, one monk wrote, is like a heart without mercy. To draw water was to draw grace from the earth. To guard it was an act of reverence. Imagine yourself now lowering a bucket into that darkness. The rope slides through your fingers, rough and familiar. You wait for the soft splash below. When you pull it back up, the bucket glistens, droplets trembling on the rim like jewels. The air smells of minerals and moss. You drink, and for a moment the centuries vanish. You taste the same coolness the nights did, the same silence that soothed them between battles. But the well wasn't only a gift, it was a responsibility. The water had to be kept clean. Guards checked daily for contamination. and servants were forbidden from washing or discarding waste near it. Violating those rules could bring punishment as harsh as treason. To harm the well was to endanger everyone. Sometimes, the well was also the last refuge. When sieges grew desperate, survivors hid in its lower chambers. Archaeologists have found makeshift steps carved into well walls, traces of fire soot, even coins and rosary beads left behind. Down there, surrounded by stone and silence, people clung to hope. Centuries later, the wells still stand. Their ropes have rotted, their buckets gone, but the echo remains. Drop a stone, and the sound travels through time, a heartbeat still pulsing in the castle's chest. It's fitting, somehow, that something so humble should outlast towers and thrones. Castles rise and crumble, but their wells endure. They keep the memory of thirst, of survival, of resilience. They remind us that power, in the end, depends on the simplest things: a few feet of rope, a turning wheel, and a little faith in what lies unseen below. And if you lean over one now, peering into its silent depth, you might hear more than the drip of water. You might hear the echo of all those who once depended on it, their laughter, their prayers, their whispered thanks to the earth. A well was never just a hole. It was a promise, and that promise, carved deep in stone, still holds. The castle's beauty was never its highest ambition. It was built to survive. Every arch, every wall, every tower was a negotiation with destruction, a long conversation between force and endurance. For centuries, they stood not because they were indestructible, but because they knew how to bend, how to heal, how to wait. Picture the moment of siege, the sky gray with smoke, the ground trembling as trebuchets release stones the size of oxen. Arrows streak the air like rain. Walls crack. Dust rises. The roar of war fills the valley. But still the castle holds. Beneath the thunder and flame, its stones whisper the language of resistance. Medieval engineers understood that no fortress could be truly invincible, but it could be clever. They learned to build in layers, creating walls that didn't just resist impact, but absorbed it. Most great castles had double or even triple curtain walls, separated by narrow passages called chemins de ronde. When the outer wall took the hit, its shock dispersed through rubble-filled cavities before reaching the inner barrier. It was primitive seismic technology, centuries before the word existed. These layered defenses gave castles a kind of flexibility, a way to breathe under pressure. Builders discovered that hard stone alone could shatter like glass when struck. So they filled their walls' cores with a mix of crushed rock, sand, and lime mortar, a cushion that shifted slightly with impact. Modern engineers studying these structures have found that the rubble core acted almost like a shock absorber, dissipating energy instead of transmitting it. Historians still argue whether this was deliberate science or luck born of necessity. But given the consistency across Europe and the Middle East, it's hard not to credit genius. The masons of Carcassonne, Croix de Chevaliers, and Windsor all use variations of the same method, thick shells of dressed stone braced around a forgiving center. When one stone cracked, the wall settled, rebalanced, and remained whole. Some of the most fascinating materials were living mortars. Builders discovered that adding volcanic ash or crushed brick to lime created a compound that hardened slowly and continued to react with air and moisture over centuries. The Romans had done it first. The medieval builders rediscovered it. This type of mortar, rich in calcium carbonate, could heal itself. When cracks formed, water seeped in, dissolved some of the lime, and recrystallized as new stone, sealing the fissure naturally. That's not legend. Scientists today have analyzed surviving walls and found microscopic structures proving that medieval mortar literally regrew minerals after damage. The castles were not static. They were self-maintaining ecosystems of chemistry and patience. At Dover Castle, restorers noticed that damaged masonry near the sea seemed to repair itself between inspections. The salt and humidity reactivated the lime compounds, forming new bonds. The masons may never have known the chemistry, but they saw the results and copied the technique faithfully. Then there were the defensive layers built into the earth itself. Moats weren't just obstacles, they absorbed shock. When siege engines hurled stones, the earth between wall and moat rippled like a cushion, saving the masonry. Some castles went further, building earthen glacis, sloped banks that deflected missiles upward instead of allowing them to strike directly. The positioning of towers followed the same principle. Round towers replaced square ones because curves distribute force evenly. A blow that would shatter a corner merely glanced off a circle. It's the difference between punching a wall and striking a drum. The impact travels, but it doesn't break. Inside the castle, the floors and ceilings cooperated too. Wooden beams embedded deep in stone created elasticity, what builders called the forgiving bones. They could flex slightly under weight or shock. Some are even set loose within their sockets to prevent rigid strain. During sieges, maintenance became ritual. Teams of masons worked day and night, packing new mortar into cracks, replacing stones before they fell. They called this the healing of the wall. Chronicles from the 14th century describe how repair crews followed behind soldiers, sealing fresh damage before the next barrage. The smell of lime hung in the air alongside smoke and blood. You can almost see it, torches flaring against the dusk, hammers ringing as men worked through the night, their hands raw but steady. The walls seemed to grow stronger the longer they fought. Some castles even employed sacrificial facades, outer layers of softer stone designed to crumble gracefully, absorbing blows while protecting the harder core beneath. At Chateau Gallard, Richard the Lionheart's engineers used a mix of chalk and flint that shattered on impact but prevented deeper cracks. Each fallen stone was like a scale from a serpent, shed, not lost. But there was another kind of resilience, one less physical but equally vital: psychological engineering. The appearance of strength was as important as strength itself. Builders carved deep grooves between stones to exaggerate their size, giving the illusion of impenetrability. They aligned towers so sunlight struck them at intimidating angles, making them appear taller. Even the echo of a gate closing was tuned, heavy, resonant, final, a sound to crush morale before the first arrow flew. During long sieges, water channels doubled as cooling systems. The slow evaporation of damp stone lowered temperatures and reduced the risk of fire. Some masons even mixed ground eggshells into plaster for durability and smoothness, reflecting heat like modern insulation. Every decision served the same quiet purpose: endurance. And then there was time, the greatest weapon of all. Siege warfare was a slow death. The castle didn't need to win, only to last. A single day's delay could turn enemies into starving refugees. The walls knew this. They didn't resist with fury, but with patience. You can feel that patience even now if you stand beside one. The stone is cool, steady, indifferent. Rain trickles through its joints, feeding invisible veins of mineral growth. Moss creeps in patterns that echo the mortar's chemistry. The wall doesn't resist nature, it partners with it. When you touch the surface, you might feel a faint vibration, not from wind or footsteps, but from centuries of quiet expansion and contraction. The wall still breathes, still mends itself, still remembers. And somewhere within those stones, the spirit of the builders endures. Those anonymous engineers who taught rock to yield without breaking, to suffer without surrender. They didn't just build defenses, they built resilience into matter itself. So the next time you see a crumbling tower against the horizon, don't see decay. See continuity. That castle isn't dying. It's still healing, slower than we can see, but faster than eternity needs. Because even after the battles ended, the stones kept their promise to endure. When people imagine castles, they picture towers, battlements, and glittering halls. But hidden behind all that grandeur were the workshops, the humming, hammering, smoky hearts that kept the fortress alive. These were the lungs and sinews of the stone giant, where labor never slept, where the rhythm of mallets and anvils beat day and night. If the Lord's chamber was the mind of the castle, The workshops were its hands. Here, in the dim light of oil lamps and hearths, men and women worked miracles with simple tools. Blacksmiths shaping raw iron into hinges, locks, and swords. Carpenters carving beams that would hold entire floors aloft. Masons chipping, fitting, polishing, weavers, tanners, candle makers, rope makers, all part of a living machine. The noise was constant. The clang of hammer on anvil, the rasp of saws, the hiss of quenching steel. Yet there was music in it, a harmony of industry. The castle wasn't just a military stronghold. It was a self-contained world. If the gates closed, life continued. Bread still baked, clothes were still mended, arrows were still fletched. Every skill was vital, every spark sacred. Let's start with the blacksmith, the magician of metal. His forge was a cathedral of fire, its glow visible even from the ramparts at night. The smith's bellows wheezed rhythmically, feeding oxygen into the flames until the coals burned white-hot. He'd lift the iron with tongs, sparks leaping like fireflies, and hammer it to shape. The sound carried through the halls, a heartbeat in steel. He didn't just make swords or armor. He crafted hinges, chains, door bolts, and cooking spits. Without him, nothing in the castle moved. Some blacksmiths even forged delicate tools for surgeons or locksmiths, working at scales of millimeters with precision that defies their age. Their forges doubled as laboratories. Medieval smiths discovered how carbon changed iron into steel, though they didn't know the chemistry. They read it in color and sound. They'd listen to the hiss of the quench, the whisper of the cooling blade, the tiny song of the metal hardening. It was intuition turned into craft. Beside the forge, carpenters worked with equal genius. They shaped the skeleton of the fortress, the doors, floors, scaffolds, siege engines, and furniture. Their saws sang through oak and ash. They used augers to bore holes, mallets to drive pegs, planes to smooth boards until they gleamed like silk. Some of their designs bordered on magic. A medieval door hinge, still working after 800 years, was built without nails, just interlocking wood joints and tension. Drawbridges, too, were feats of carpentry. Massive beams perfectly counterbalanced, chains passing through wooden gears that fit with machine-like precision. The engineers of today still study them. Then came the masons, the masters of the wall. Their workshop wasn't confined to one room, but spread across the site. You could hear them everywhere. The chink of chisels, the thud of hammers, the low murmur of measured talk. Each mason's mark, his unique symbol, was carved into the stones he laid, not for glory, but for accountability. If a wall failed, his mark told the story. They worked by sight and instinct. A master mason could tell a stone's future just by tapping it with his hammer. The sound revealed cracks invisible to the eye. They mixed lime and sand by feel alone, balancing the proportions like chefs with ancient recipes. They could build a wall true and level without a single instrument of metal, just cords, plumb bobs, and the steady trust of experience. Around them, apprentices scurried, mixing mortar, fetching water, hauling stone on sledges. It was back-breaking labor, yet deeply communal. At dusk, when the tools were laid down, the masons would share bread beside the fires, their hands white with dust, their talk full of geometry and jokes. Other workshops thrived in quieter corners. The tanners who treated leather for belts and saddles, the rope makers spinning hemp along long corridors, the candle makers melting tallow in vats that smelled of smoke and salt. Every trade was essential. If one failed, the castle weakened. The rope maker's hall was a world of its own, long, narrow, stretching sometimes 100 feet. Men walked backward as they twisted strands of hemp, humming to keep the rhythm. Rope was life for drawbridges, cranes, wells, and siege engines. Without it, the castle could neither lift nor lower, attack nor defend. There were glassmakers, too, though their craft was rarer. They worked with sand, ash, and lime, blowing molten glass through long tubes to form the colored panes that glowed in chapel windows. A single small window might take a week to make. The pigments came from crushed minerals, copper for green, cobalt for blue, gold dust for red. When sunlight passed through, it turned the cold stone halls into stained rainbows. Historians still debate whether these workshops were permanent fixtures or temporary ones during construction. In truth, they evolved. A castle under construction was an organism in growth. A castle in use was an organism in repair. And so the workshops never truly slept, they adapted. One corner might house a siege engineer's bench, covered in sketches of catapults and counterweight trebuchets. Another might hold molds for lead shot or clay tiles. Somewhere, a potter turned his wheel, shaping jars that carried oil or grain. A single fortress contained the entire microcosm of medieval technology, a laboratory hidden behind battlements. You can almost smell it if you close your eyes. Iron and smoke, sawdust and resin, wet clay and hot wax. The air thick with purpose. The builders didn't think of themselves as inventors, but they were. They forged the tools of progress one blow, one spark at a time. Even silence had its place. The scribe's corner, perhaps the most fragile workshop of all. In a room apart from the noise, a clerk copied records by candlelight, his quill scratching across vellum. He documented every wage, every stone delivered, every tool repaired. His work preserved not just numbers but memory. Without him, the castle's story would fade. Sometimes, those documents mention women at work, spinners, cooks, seamstresses, brewers. Their labor, too, was a kind of engineering. They managed heat, fermentation, preservation, all sciences disguised as chores. The ale they brewed was safer to drink than water. The bread they baked could last through winter sieges. Their wisdom was practical alchemy. And when the day ended, and the tools were hung on pegs, the castle exhaled. The fires dimmed, the air cooled, but the smell of work lingered. The walls still hummed faintly from the echoes of hammer and anvil. The fortress slept, but its hands, those patient workshops, dreamed of motion. Centuries later, archaeologists still find the fingerprints of those artisans. A chisel mark under a window, a clay mold buried in the earth, a carpenter's peg untouched by rot. Each trace is a whisper of life preserved in labor. The kings and knights who ruled these castles have turned to dust. But the workers, the nameless army of makers, left something eternal. Their tools may be gone, but their touch remains. Because in the end, a castle is not just a monument of war. It's a museum of craft, a frozen symphony of human hands. And as you drift toward sleep, you can almost hear them still. The blacksmith's hammer, the carpenter's saw, the steady breath of fire, softly shaping the world, one spark at a time. Every castle, no matter how mighty its walls, had one eternal enemy: darkness. Stone is strong but greedy, it swallows light. Without the careful guidance of fire and window, the fortress would have been nothing more than a beautiful tomb. Yet somehow, these medieval engineers, men who measured with string and intuition, found ways to make even the heaviest walls glow. Light in a castle was both practical and spiritual. It revealed danger, guided work, and inspired awe. And it was managed with astonishing precision. Every slit, every aperture, every pane of colored glass served not merely as decoration, but as strategy, controlling brightness, temperature, and mood. Step into the great hall at dawn. The rising sun slips through tall, narrow windows, turning dust into golden haze. The light is soft, indirect, almost deliberate. Builders placed those openings to catch the morning glow, when warmth was welcome but heat was not yet oppressive. At sunset, the western wall flares with a final burst of amber, timed perfectly for the evening meal when nobles gathered to feast. The building itself seems to breathe with the day, its walls exhaling light. These weren't coincidences. Masons studied the sun's path as carefully as they studied the stones. Before laying the first course, they watched the shadows of towers, marking how far the light would reach in winter and summer. In some castles, narrow windows align perfectly with solstices, spilling beams of sunlight into specific chambers only on those days. Historians still debate whether it was spiritual symbolism or calendar making in disguise. The earliest castles had few openings. Defense demanded darkness. But as siege technologies evolved and the threat of constant attack waned, windows multiplied. What began as arrow slits slowly widened into looped openings, then into pairs of Gothic lancets framed by slender stone mullions. Each transition was a victory for light over fear. Yet these architects never forgot caution. To them, light was both gift and vulnerability. A window could invite arrows as easily as sunshine, so they designed double recesses, wide within, narrow without, creating the illusion of generosity without weakness. From inside, sunlight poured in. From outside, all you saw was a slit. The wall, like a magician, hid its secret. At night, light reversed its role, from invader to guardian. Torches, candles, and hearths turned the castle into a galaxy of tiny suns. Firelight shimmered on metal and tapestry, flickering like breath. The flames' reflections doubled in polished armor, creating the impression of movement even when the hall was still. Some builders placed brass or copper plates behind candelabras to reflect light outward, a medieval mirror, amplifying brightness without wasting fuel. And there were the glassmakers, the hidden alchemists who turned sand into light. Medieval glass was rarely clear. It rippled, bubbled, shimmered in shades of green, blue, or amber. Each imperfection bent sunlight into soft halos that danced across the walls. To modern eyes it might seem flawed, but to those who lived then, it was divine, light given texture. In chapels and oratories, stained glass transformed light into story. Kings prayed beneath windows of ruby and sapphire that told their own ancestry, their victories, their faith. The colors weren't chosen by chance. Deep blue cooled the chamber, softening heat. Crimson kindled warmth in winter. Yellow glass was often used near kitchens and workshops, where bright illumination mattered most. Medieval builders understood, without science, how color could shape emotion. Historians still argue how widely stained glass was used in castles compared to cathedrals. But excavations at sites like Coucy and Windsor have uncovered fragments, proof that even fortresses yearn for beauty. These shards, when held to the sun, still glow after 800 years, their colors as vivid as fire. Some of the most intriguing optical tricks weren't about glass at all, but geometry. The vaulted ceilings and polished floors created optical illusions. Spaces seemed larger, taller, brighter than they were. Builders angled walls slightly inward near windows, making the openings appear deeper and grander. The eye read height where there was none. There's even evidence that castle architects experimented with what we now call light mapping. They placed pale limestone near dark sandstone, knowing that contrast sharpened perception. In a dim hall, a single pale column seemed to shine on its own. They learned, intuitively, how light interacts with surface. Smooth stones glowed. Rough stones drank light greedily. Some walls were deliberately left uneven so that torchlight would sparkle across them, mimicking movement and life. Light also carried symbolism. To the medieval mind, it was divine. The higher you lived in the castle, the more light you had. The lord's chambers were drenched in it. The servants' quarters lay in shadow. Illumination became hierarchy. Even architecture obeyed theology. God above, man below, darkness beneath. And yet, the engineers found ways to cheat the hierarchy. Corridors and stairwells, though narrow, often featured hidden windows that caught stray light and funneled it through the darkness. The effect was subtle but powerful, a reminder that even in shadow, a whisper of day remained. Firelight, too, had its choreography. A single torch could illuminate a room if placed correctly. Builders placed sconces opposite reflective surfaces or near light-colored plaster. They also mastered ventilation. Small vents above torches carried smoke away without extinguishing flame. Many chimneys doubled as light flues, carrying both warmth and brightness upward through shafts. In certain castles, water itself became part of the lighting system. Pools, fountains, and moats reflected sunlight into lower courtyards. The rippling light danced on stone, softening its severity. Some of those reflections were so consistent that they might have been planned, a deliberate interplay of light and water, of heaven and earth. At night, moonlight took over the work. Builders knew how to catch it. Wide terraces, pale, paving stones, and mirrored metals made the most of its glow. Travelers resting in outer courtyards often wrote of castles that shone like silver beneath a full moon. The architects had found a way to let the night itself participate in illumination. And perhaps the most haunting trick of all was silence. In near-total darkness, light became soundless drama. The first spark of a torch, the sudden flare of a candle. Every illumination felt sacred. The watchers around it held their breath as if witnessing birth. The builders may not have known physics, but they understood emotion. Control the light, and you control awe. Even centuries later, when roofs have fallen and walls lie open to the sky, their understanding endures. Visit a ruin at sunset, and you'll see it. The light still finds its way. The windows long broken, yet the angles still true. It slides through archways, bends around corners, strikes the very same stones it did when knights dined beneath them. That's the real magic of their craft. They built for eternity's light, not just the days. As you imagine it now, picture the glow of torchlight flickering on ancient walls. The air feels thick with dust and amber light, warm and steady, the kind that quiets your thoughts. It's the same light that lulled soldiers, monks, lovers, and kings. The same light that told them, even in the deepest night, that morning would always return. And maybe tonight, as you drift off, that same ancient glow will follow you, gentle, golden, infinite. By the late Middle Ages, a quiet transformation swept across Europe's stone fortresses. The age of constant siege was waning, and the thunder of catapults gave way to the music of lutes. Castles that once bristled with battlements began to soften. The language of defense yielded to the language of comfort. And so the warrior's fortress slowly became the noble's palace. The shift didn't happen overnight. You can almost picture the hesitation of a lord standing in his cold, great hall, staring at the soot-streaked walls, thinking, perhaps this could be beautiful. And slowly it became so. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the armor of architecture began to relax. Moats turned from barriers into ornaments, reflecting gardens instead of flames. Drawbridges became decorative, their chains polished for show. Arrow slits widened into elegant windows framed by carved stone, no longer meant for bows but for sunlight and air. The castle was learning to breathe differently. Historians call this period the domestication of the fortress, a transformation driven by peace, wealth, and an emerging sense of art. As gunpowder rendered thick walls obsolete, nobility redirected their genius toward living well rather than merely surviving. Builders turned their minds from murder holes to music halls, from gatehouses to galleries. Step inside such a transformed castle, say Burg-Eltz in Germany or the Loire chateaus of France, and you'll feel the change instantly. The heavy darkness gives way to warmth. Fireplaces bloom with carved angels and vines. Ceilings glow with painted stars. The once raw geometry of defense evolves into grace. But the metamorphosis didn't erase the past. It built upon it. Beneath the tapestries and polished floors, the old bones of fortification still linger. A noble's parlor might rest atop an ancient armory. The guest chambers might once have housed archers. The beauty of the palace came not from forgetting war, but from transforming it, turning the tools of fear into the architecture of peace. The very word castle began to shift meaning. No longer just a fortress, it became a symbol of prestige, refinement, lineage. Families competed to outshine one another in artistry. Sculptors replaced siege engineers. Painters replaced blacksmiths. Every stone became a statement. The courtyards that once echoed with marching soldiers now filled with fountains, peacocks, and laughter. Nobles commissioned gardens inspired by paradise itself. labyrinths of trimmed hedges, marble statues, and ponds that mirrored the sky. These were not idle whims. They reflected an evolving philosophy that harmony with nature was the new form of power. The interiors changed most of all. Great halls were divided into smaller, more intimate rooms. Privacy, once a foreign concept in communal medieval life, became a luxury. Lords and ladies wanted chambers for reading, for music, for sleep undisturbed. Thick curtains muffled echoes. Floors were tiled or carpeted to hush footsteps. The castle that once shouted began to whisper. With this came a revolution in furniture. Heavy benches gave way to cushioned chairs. Bed frames grew taller, canopies billowing with embroidered silk. Even the beds themselves became sanctuaries, surrounded by warmth and color. A lord's rest, one chronicler wrote, is now as much an art as his armor once was. Walls, once bare and functional, became canvases. Frescoes bloomed across them. Myths, saints, lovers, landscapes. The ceiling beams turned to painted constellations. Builders began to hide their engineering beneath ornament. Columns disguised flues, and ribbed vaults carried both beauty and structure. Form no longer followed function, it danced with it. And the light, oh the light. Windows multiplied, their glass brighter and clearer than ever. Courtyards opened to the sun. Chandeliers hung like captured constellations, their candles mirrored in polished brass. Evening transformed into spectacle. 100 small flames became one shimmering galaxy beneath the vaulted ceilings. Historians still debate whether this evolution was purely aesthetic or profoundly spiritual. Some say it reflected humanity's growing optimism, a shift from survival to expression. Others think it was practical. Peace simply allowed more time for beauty. Perhaps both are true. The Renaissance spirit was dawning, and with it came a rediscovery of proportion, comfort, and the self. The noble's household mirrored this interchange. Warriors became patrons. Feasts became performances. The great hall no longer smelled of sweat and steel, but of rosewater and baked pastries. Music replaced marching orders. Tutors and poets joined the castle's retinue alongside knights. It was a redefinition of strength, not the power to conquer, but the grace to create. One fascinating relic of this transition is the solar, a private chamber usually on the upper floors, bathed in sunlight. The name itself reveals the new priorities: warmth, illumination, solitude. Here, the Lord might read letters, play chess, or simply gaze out over the fields in peace. No one needed armor in the solar. The only weapons were words and thought. Still, even in its gentleness, the castle never forgot its roots. The gates remained thick. The towers stood ready. But now, they were symbols of legacy, not necessity. Power became cultural, a reflection of taste rather than terror. The defensive walls had become picture frames for wealth and wisdom. Yet, for all their luxury, these palaces carried a faint nostalgia. The architecture remembered its former strength. A portcullis here, a narrow stair there, like old scars beneath new silk. Even as nobles turned to comfort, they honored the echoes of endurance. It was as though the stones themselves missed the days of purpose, the thrill of survival, the tension of the siege. You can feel that blend of pride and melancholy in the ruins today. Visit one of these half-fortress, half-palace hybrids at sunset, and you'll see it. The golden light pouring through arched windows, falling across faded frescoes and empty fireplaces. The past and future meet there, strength softened by beauty, war remembered through peace. It's strange, isn't it? The same walls that once repelled armies now invite admiration. The same towers that once launched arrows now lift chandeliers. The evolution feels almost human, as though the building itself grew tired of violence and chose tenderness instead. Perhaps that's why these places still captivate us. They remind us that power can transform, that even stone can learn gentleness. The fortress didn't die, it matured. It learned that protection doesn't always require walls. Sometimes it requires warmth, light, and music. And tonight, as you drift deeper into calm, imagine that transformation happening slowly around you. The clang of armor fading into the strum of a lute, the roar of battle turning to laughter echoing in bright halls. The stone softens, the windows widen. The castle dreams itself into peace. The end of an age rarely arrives with a thunderclap. It comes quietly, like dust settling after centuries of noise. So it was with the castles. One by one, the great fortresses emptied, not destroyed by war, but abandoned by time. Their halls fell silent, their courtyards overgrown, their wells forgotten. The world moved forward and the stones stay behind. For centuries, these strongholds had been the beating hearts of kingdoms. Now they became their ghosts. Cannons had changed warfare forever. A single bombardment could shatter what no army had breached. The nobility, seeking comfort and safety, drifted toward the cities. They traded moats for marble, towers for salons. The castle's proud silhouette remained on the horizon, but its purpose had faded. Imagine the moment the last lord rode away. Hooves echoing over the drawbridge, servants following with carts of linen and books, torches dimming in the windows. The gates closed for the final time. Silence descended like fog. At first, the silence must have felt uneasy. A fortress without footsteps feels unnatural. The air holds its breath, waiting for laughter or orders that never come. Birds begin to nest in the arrow slits. Ivy creeps along the battlements. Rain falls through broken roofs, dripping in slow rhythms that sound like thought. The castle, once full of life, begins to listen to itself. And yet, even in decay, these structures retained a kind of dignity. Their walls, built for eternity, refused to die easily. Moss covered the stones, but didn't weaken them. Water pooled in the courtyards, but the foundations held. Some rooms stayed perfectly dry centuries after the fires went cold. It was as if the architecture itself mourned, but would not surrender. Historians often call this the Age of Ruination. From the 16th century onward, Europe's landscape filled with empty fortresses, monuments to a vanished way of life. Some were dismantled for stone, their blocks reused in cottages and cathedrals. Others became quarries for villages that had once served them. But many simply endured, haunting their hillsides like sleeping giants. Travelers of the Enlightenment found poetry in that decay. Writers and painters began to romanticize the ruins. What had once been symbols of feudal oppression became symbols of nostalgia. They called them melancholy temples of time. Poets walked among the crumbling walls, feeling history whisper beneath their feet. The ruined castle became a mirror for the soul, a reminder that all power fades and all beauty becomes memory. But the stones themselves never despaired. They adapted. Nature claimed them, and in that claiming gave them new life. Roots pried through mortar, yet also held the structure upright. Owls nested in towers once used by centuries. Foxes dug dens beneath old kitchens. Insect colonized the cracks like tiny architects. The castle that had once repelled the world now welcomed it. In some places, villagers used the empty halls for shelter. Shepherds lit fires in great chambers. Hermits carved chapels into the rubble. Children played where knights once trained. The fortress became a quiet companion to the living, no longer master, but neighbor. There's an odd comfort in the way stone decays. It doesn't vanish suddenly. It erodes slowly, gently, with grace. The process itself feels like memory softening around the edges. You can still see the intention of the builders, the curve of a window, the rhythm of arches, even when half the wall is gone. The craftsmanship survives the centuries better than its purpose ever did. And still, the old engineering holds surprises. Some wells still produce water. Some staircases, though half collapsed, remain perfectly balanced. In places like Bodiam or Dunatar, the mortar continues to harden over time, its chemistry still alive. Even the cracks form in deliberate patterns, as though the stones are aging consciously. Historians still debate how much maintenance these ruins received after abandonment. Some were visited by caretakers who patched roofs or mended bridges for travelers. Others were deliberately left to crumble, seen as relics of tyranny. But in both cases, they became part of the landscape, neither wholly human nor wholly natural. To walk among them today is to walk between worlds. The grass muffles your steps. The air smells of damp stone and iron. Every sound feels amplified. The flap of a bird's wing, the whisper of wind through empty halls. Sometimes when sunlight pours through a broken window, it looks like time itself has shape. You can almost imagine the ghosts, not of people, but of purpose. The walls seem to remember the clamor they once contained. In the courtyard, you might sense the echo of a blacksmith's hammer. In the great hall, the faint murmur of feasts long finished. These aren't hauntings in the supernatural sense. They're memories, etched into the mineral, replaying in silence. There's a curious academic debate about whether castles were meant to last this long. Some argue their longevity was accidental. Others insist it was destiny. The builders, they say, chose durability over convenience because they wanted their work to outlive them. A good stone should defy its mason, wrote one 14th century craftsman. And many did. In the Romantic era, artists rediscovered the ruins as subjects of beauty. Painters traveled with sketchbooks, capturing ivy-draped towers and moonlit courtyards. Philosophers saw metaphors in every crack, civilization's hubris, time's mercy. Tourists followed, drawn by the promise of quiet awe. The ruins became destinations of contemplation. And even now, in the modern world, their allure persists. Visitors still stand beneath broken arches, feeling the weight of centuries press softly around them. Some bring cameras, others just listen. The castle doesn't speak anymore, not in the old language of war or rule, but it hums, a low, patient resonance. Perhaps that's what endurance truly means. Not noise, but quiet. Not defiance, but acceptance. The castle, stripped of banners and purpose, becomes pure presence, a sculpture of time. If you listen carefully, the silence isn't empty. It's full of everything that came before. It holds the laughter, the fear, the hammer blows, the rain, the years. The stones, warmed by countless suns, still remember light even when the clouds hang low. And as you imagine yourself walking through such a place, grass brushing your boots, wind tugging your sleeves, you can feel that echo rise to meet you. You're part of its story now. The past folds around you like mist, soft and endless. For the first time in centuries, the castle feels inhabited again, not by lords or soldiers, but by witness. You. And as the day fades and the last light drifts across the broken ramparts, the stones seem to breathe one final word into the wind. Still here. Hey guys, tonight we've reached the final chapter of our quiet journey through the castles of the Middle Ages. Those patient giants of stone that watch humanity grow, falter, and begin again. You've walked their halls, heard their whispers, felt their cold walls breathe with memory. But now, as we drift together towards sleep, it's time to listen to what they still have to say, not about war or walls, but about time itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into this final story together. Close your eyes. Imagine the castle not as ruin or relic, but as dream. The torches are out. The stones gleam faintly in the moonlight. The world beyond the walls has gone quiet. Somewhere, a single drop of water falls into a forgotten cistern, its echo rippling through the bones of the building like a heartbeat too slow to measure. For hundreds of years, these structures have stood motionless. But if you could see the way time moves through them, you'd realize they're still alive. The stones expand and contract with the weather. The walls sweat and breathe. Lichens bloom like tiny galaxies across the battlements. Every crack and groove is a wrinkle of memory. The castle is not a ruin. It's an old creature dreaming of firelight and laughter. dreaming of footsteps and banners, dreaming of silence and rain. Once these fortresses defined power, kings ruled from them, armies marched for them, lovers met in their shadows. But the centuries have transformed them into something softer, into teachers, maybe, or monks made of rock. They no longer fight the world. They contemplate it. You can almost imagine that if you pressed your ear to the wall, you'd hear not just the echo of history, but the slow rhythm of the earth turning, the pulse of time itself. Because that's what these castles became, vessels of endurance. Proof that even the hardest things can change gently. Historians still debate whether castles were meant to outlast their builders or simply serve their time. But perhaps their endurance isn't just physical. Maybe it's emotional. Maybe every soul that ever passed through them, knight, mason, servant, queen, left a small trace in the dust, in the lime, in the air. If you walk alone through a ruin at dusk, you can feel those traces. They aren't ghosts, not exactly. They're gestures. The warmth of a hand on stone that cooled centuries ago. The echo of laughter that refuses to fade. The memory of courage, or exhaustion, or love, somehow held inside the molecules of mortar. And as the centuries rolled forward, through plagues, revolutions, and quiet decay, the castles never forgot. They let the grass grow through their cracks, the wind whistle through their gates, but they kept those memories. They became living libraries of human resilience. Look at them now, open to the sky, yet still standing. Their towers broken, yet their foundations unshaken. Birds nest where banners once hung. Sunlight floods through shattered windows that were once narrow slits for arrows. What was once built for defense now invites light freely. There's something poetic about that. Walls that once repelled the world, now letting it in. You could say the castles learned something that people often forget. That strength doesn't mean resisting forever. Sometimes it means allowing change to happen, letting the vines grow, letting the wind sing through the gaps, letting time finish what war could not. And yet, even softened, they remain proud. Visit one at dawn, when the mist still clings to the hills, and you'll see it. Those familiar outlines rising like old kings at rest, dignified, unbent. They may be covered in moss, but the geometry is still perfect. The arches still hold their curve. The wells still reach the earth. The secret, perhaps, is that they were built not just with stone, but with devotion. The masons carved their names into hidden corners not for fame, but so the future would know that human hands once cared this deeply. The builders prayed with chisels instead of words. Every cut was a psalm. Every tower, a hymn to endurance. Historians can measure the thickness of walls, but they can't measure the reverence that seeped into every surface. That's why these structures endure when everything else fades, because they were built with faith, not just skill. Faith that what we shape might outlive our lives. Maybe that's why people still dream of castles. Why children still draw them. Why travelers still climb their crumbling steps. They speak to something ancient in us, the longing for permanence in a fleeting world. We see in them what we wish for ourselves, to stand tall through change, to weather the centuries with grace, to hold our memories even as the wind wears us down. If you listen, really listen, you can almost hear the dialogue between stone and time. Time says, "I will wear you away." And stone answers, "Not yet." And they've been having that same quiet conversation for 1,000 years. The rain falls, the moss spreads, the sun rises, the walls glow. People come and go, whispering, laughing, forgetting. The castle remains softened, yes, but awake. And in its endurance, it offers something comforting. It reminds you that even when everything changes, when the towers of your own life crumble, when noise turns to silence, something within you endures too. The foundation, the shape, the essence of what you built. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself resting against one of those ancient walls. The stone beneath you cool, solid, eternal. The air smells faintly of earth and rain. The last light fades, and the stars take their watch where torches once burned. You breathe in rhythm with the building, slow, steady, peaceful. And in that moment, time itself seems to pause. The centuries fold around you like a blanket. The weight of history becomes soft like fabric. You realize that everything that's ever been built, loved, or lost still exists somewhere. In matter, in memory, in the quiet hum of the universe. The castle dreams. And now, so do you. Sleep well, traveler. The stones are keeping watch. Sweet dreams.